A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. Because let's be honest, on this whole entire thing, there's so many films out there that I've never had the chance to talk about up until this day and age. Recent years have allowed me to really gain access to a lot of things I would normally not be allowed to even watch for a second. I could probably blame YouTube for pretty much exposing me to a lot of things out there. And I'll tell you what, I was only 10 years old when I first saw Freddy vs. Jason, but I mean, I've already talked a bit about that. So that one's not going to count, really. But something that is going to count is one that I probably haven't really talked about at all. Maybe just a few references to it, but Toy Story 4, the fourth official entry into the Toy Story franchise, and by far the most successful in terms of box office and most reviews that have taken place. It's certainly not like the majority of which that happen to be super successful just because. When you take a lot of films out there, Avatar, Titanic, Transformers Age of Extinction, Frozen, and then of course there's Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Let's add Toy Story 4 to the mix because it was another reason why Disney had become, well, influentially successful throughout 2019. Just over $10 billion in the global box office it managed to score, which is a huge record in comparison to how most of its previous yearly entries have basically taken upon us. But other than 2019 being the most successful for Disney by far, I will say that Toy Story 4 just so happens to be quite an amazing movie in general. I certainly wouldn't consider it any better than most of the others, but the way I see it, this one sure is worth watching. Every single second of this is basically Pixar's extreme mastery at the arts of animation, comedy, and pretty much a lot of other things that happen to deal with a lot of its own previous successors out there. Starting back in '95 with Toy Story 1, which took several years just to make from concept to completion, it really did bring upon a huge revolutionary tactic into the world of animation when it came time to basically creating a feature film that had nothing but CG in it. And Toy Story was in fact the first to really make such a big success, but then of course throughout the remainder of the 90s we were able to get plenty of others out there. DreamWorks ended up having a bunch of their own CG put into effect, especially after the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg had been pretty much terminated by Michael Eisner, who was at the time CEO of the Walt Disney Company. That's how DreamWorks eventually came to be after Katzenberg and several others have gathered together. But then of course there eventually came other competitors in there as well. Illumination, Columbia, and even Blue Sky Studios, which is now defunct. Toy Story 4, however, was pretty much the most shining light of all. This was definitely the one out there that became the ultimate success, by far. Even though there's been a lot of new, more recent entries out there in Pixar's history, especially when you take a look at the entire year of 2020, where there came such big stars out there in Pixar's recent film history, like Onward and Soul, they don't necessarily compare very much. But we can say that Toy Story 4, being a film that grossed well over $1 billion in comparison to its predecessors, it really did prove to be a success in so many ways. But as far as the plot goes, the character lineup goes, everything else that goes together to make the film so successful, it's pretty simple really. Toy Story 4 takes place after Toy Story 3, of course, and not to mention all of the other things that came alongside it, like all the short films and all the other little things that came around, TV series, spin-offs and all that. So Toy Story 4 basically goes back to the roots and takes place after all of these things. Bonnie is outside of daycare en route to an actual school in kindergarten and first grade. But of course, the times spent there were not necessarily at the best. Sheriff Woody, who was again voiced by Tom Hanks, ends up sneaking aboard a backpack to try and cheer up Bonnie by creating some sort of toy out of a spork. And that's pretty much where Forky comes into place. Actor Tony Hale provides the voice for this character, and I can really tell you, that is an amazing performance. Of all the things that I've seen Tony Hale star as, it's probably this one that can rank higher amongst many of the others. Well, anyways, Forky tries to do everything as possible to try and get away from the other toys, to basically go into the trash, because apparently that's where forks go when they're used for food. And then of course we get ourselves a nice little montage that basically does do a lot with the film itself. But then after all that, we basically have quite a film that takes place. Especially given the fact that Bonnie was having such a tough time at school, that's when the family decides to go on a bit of a vacation for a little while. Their RV ends up breaking down along the way though, and they end up having to stop at a small town where there exists a carnival, plus some antique shops, and likewise. So it's important to note that with all the things that have come by, all the details that have taken place, Toy Story 4 proved to give us a lot of excitement, suspense, and even a little bit of comedy as time went on. Of course, if you're familiar with the other characters, yes, they're all included. Except for some of the few others, like Prospector Pete, Lotso the stuffed bear, and, well, obviously Sid Phillips. Even though there had been some trivia that somehow confirmed that Sid Phillips supposedly made a cameo appearance in Part 3, we don't really see that in Part 4. Same thing goes with Andy. There's no Andy in here. And that's mostly because of the fact that Andy left for college in Part 3, which supposedly would have ended the series once and for all. But let's just say that things somehow get even better. Way better. All the toys end up reuniting, but then eventually something ends up coming up. An antique shop, which is filled with scary puppets, plus a small toy called Gabby Gabby, who is actually missing some sort of voice chip in there, and tries to steal Woody's string and voice box. And of course you're familiar with what I'm saying, right? You pull back on the string of Sheriff Woody, and it basically gives out several different unique quotes said by Sheriff Woody. But the film itself is probably just a bit more than, well, how I've described it. It really is at the peak of animation. I could probably compare it to others like Finding Dory or The Incredibles 2, which came before them. But Toy Story 4 is a lot more than just a sum of how extremely vital the animation on this one was. Because this was in fact top of the line, compared to Toy Story 3 even. Sure, for the time period in 2010, that one really held off on its own. It still does kind of hold up because of its age, but Toy Story 4, there's a good chance that it might have the same sort of lasting effect. But anyways, I really do have to mention a lot of things here. There are twists involved, like in the fact that, well, in the opening scene, which does seem to take place between Parts 1 and Parts 2, because of the fact that they include RC and Bo Peep. Although it is more likely that it might have taken place between 2 and 3. That ginormous 11-year gap between both of those films, this one might have been one of the many attempts to try and give us a little history on what happened in between 2 and 3. How Bo Peep went missing and all the others pretty much. So, but then of course, guess what? Bo Peep shows up again. And then of course, eventually, Woody, Bo Peep, and a couple other characters out there, Duke Kaboom, Bunny, Ducky, and even Forky, they all go together to try and stop Gabby Gabby from doing anything horrid. But eventually, there comes a point where, well, Woody's forced to give in. Gives the voice box and the string to Gabby Gabby, and now Gabby Gabby's the one who pretty much has the unique voice, in a way. So as depressing as that is, finally losing Woody's trademark sort of string, I guess that probably is what maybe would have happened at any point anyways. Especially when you compare it to the fact that, well, Buzz Lightyear had pretty much lost the initial sort of Star Command vibe to it in the first film. In the second and third, we would pretty much see that Buzz's realization as an actual toy and not a real Space Ranger pretty much came into play. So of course it's that same old sort of like turnaround or turning point that happens in one's life where one of the main characters ends up having to make a serious decision. And in this case, it's pretty much the same sort of thing. Except this one happens in only a few minutes. Woody's voice box gets taken. At least with permission, but the thing is, I also have to mention the ending here. It is unbelievable. Woody has a small group going along with Bo Peep, Bunny, Ducky, Duke Kaboom, pretty much out with the carnival, so that way they can keep entertaining kids and they can keep on, well, giving people life the way they need to. While Buzz Lightyear and pretty much all the others, they end up sticking with Bonnie. Pretty much. I can't really be sure if that ending is supposed to be some sort of cliffhanger to set the pace for another sequel, but I will tell you this. I've pretty much pitched in my own plausible idea on what a Toy Story 5 could potentially be like. And with a lot of people speculating that the release date of this could take place in 2023 or 2024, it is probably a possibility that we just might have one. If a Toy Story 5 is supposed to take place, then maybe there could be a good likelihood that a lot of ideas might have to be set in, so that way Pixar can get the creativity that they'll need to work with this. But, sure enough, I actually made myself a document. A bit of a synopsis on what a Toy Story 5 would probably be like. If you do want to read it for yourself, it's quite a few pages long, pretty much, and I still have yet to finish it up, but if you want to check that out, then I suggest you go to the link in the description box below to check out my little synopsis on what a Toy Story 5's plotline should potentially be. If I want to give the score here on Toy Story 4, then pretty much speaking, like I said, it's not really going to be like part 1, 2, or 3 in any ways. But I will say it goes up to about 8.8 out of 10. I'm probably not necessarily going to talk a bit about the scores of all the other 3, but as simple as that, Toy Story 4 is at a relative sweet spot, the way I see it. But that's going to be it for today anyway. So if you want to see more, go down to my channel. Then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.